Something impossible happened. An entire frozen empire thawed in one night, and no one knew why. Witnesses whispered only one thing. A human spoke a word their species had buried for centuries. Tell me where you're watching from. Subscribe to help this channel grow. And get ready, because the story begins now. Marcus Hale had been on Aralis Prime for 3 weeks, and the cold still found ways to surprise him. Not the temperature, he had gear for that, but the other kind. The kind that lived in the silence between the Aurenians when they passed each other in the street without a word. The kind that made a planet feel empty even when it was full of people. He spent his days at the climate reactor, a massive structure of crystalline metal that hummed with barely contained energy. His job was simple: make sure the ancient thing didn't explode while the Imperial Council decided what to do with it. Marcus didn't ask questions. He just turned wrenches and checked pressure valves the way he'd done on a dozen other worlds. Marcus didn't know it yet, but that word would change an entire empire. The Frosthaven Tavern was his refuge after work. It sat on the edge of the maintenance district, where humans and lower caste Aurenians mixed without the rigid protocols of the upper city. The owner, a grizzled Aurenian named Keth, tolerated Marcus mostly because he paid in advance and didn't cause trouble. That's where he first saw her. Sarai and I moved through the dim space like a ghost, trying to remember how to haunt. Her skin had that characteristic Aurenian luminescence, a soft blue-silver glow that marked her species, but it seemed muted somehow, dulled. She wore ceremonial robes that had seen better decades, the embroidered edges frayed and stained. When she set down drinks, her movements had the precision of someone who'd been trained for something far more important than serving strangers. Marcus watched her over his data pad, pretending to review reactor schematics. She fascinated him in a way he couldn't quite name. There was something in her eyes, those striking blue-silver depths that reminded him of the reactor itself. Something powerful, contained, waiting. She hadn't cried in 47 years. Not until that night. For 3 evenings, he observed the same pattern. Sarai served drinks with mechanical efficiency. Customers spoke to her. She responded with single words. No one seemed to notice, or maybe no one cared. It was normal here, this emotional distance. The Aurenians prided themselves on logic, on control, on the absence of what they called chaos variables. On the 4th night, everything changed. A small Aurenian child, maybe 6 in their years, stumbled near the bar. Marcus saw it happen in slow motion. The kid tripped over a loose floor panel, went down hard, crying out. Blood, bright blue against pale skin, welled from a gashed knee. Sarai froze. She stood there, tray in hand, staring at the child. Her face showed something Marcus hadn't seen before. Conflict. She took a half-step forward, then stopped. Her hands trembled. The glass fell, and with it, 300 years of silence. No one else moved. In Aurenian culture, helping without formal request was considered presumptuous. Interfering in another's difficulty implied they were incapable. So they watched, waiting for the child's parent to finish their conversation across the room and notice. Marcus felt something twist in his chest. He'd worked on enough alien worlds to know cultural sensitivity mattered. He'd learned to observe, not interfere. But watching Sarai stand there, clearly wanting to help, but paralyzed by something he didn't understand, broke something in him. He stood, walked to the bar where she stood frozen, and looked at her directly. Aluma, he said quietly. He'd seen the word on an old mural near the reactor site, half buried in ice. He thought it meant compassion, or kindness, something like that. The effect was immediate and devastating. Sarai's eyes went wide. The tray slipped from her fingers, hitting the floor with a crash that silenced the entire tavern. For 3 heartbeats, she just stared at him, her face cycling through expressions. Shock, recognition, disbelief, and then something that looked like pain so old it had fossilized. And then she broke. The sound that came from her was raw, unchained. Tears, actual tears, streamed down her luminescent face. Her shoulders shook. She pressed both hands to her mouth as if trying to hold back something too big to contain. Around them, the tavern had gone absolutely silent. Other Orinians stared in horror, in fascination, in fear. It was just a word, but some words are dangerous. Marcus reached out instinctively, pulling a napkin from the bar and offering it to her. She took it with shaking hands, her eyes never leaving his face, and something passed between them in that moment. A question, an accusation, a desperate hope. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to," Marcus started, but she was already moving, stumbling toward the back room. Keth, the owner, watched her go with an expression Marcus couldn't read. Then the old Orinian's eyes fixed on Marcus with something that might have been warning. "You should leave," Keth said quietly. "Now." Marcus left, but as he walked back through the frozen streets toward his quarters, he couldn't shake the image of her face. The way she'd looked at him, like he'd somehow reached through time and touched something that had been sleeping for centuries. He still didn't understand, but in 72 hours, he would wish he'd never spoken that word at all. Behind him, in the tavern, Serainai sat in the back room, clutching the napkin he'd given her. For the first time in 47 years, she let herself feel, and in feeling, remembered everything her people had tried to forget. The word echoed in her mind. Aluma. 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 She had thought it was dead. She had hoped it was dead. Because if it wasn't, if somewhere in her frozen heart that concept still lived, then everything her family had done, every justification for the decree, every reason for 3 centuries of emotional silence, became a lie. "You shouldn't have said that," she whispered to the empty room. "Now they'll know we still feel." In the upper city, in the obsidian towers where the Imperial Council met, sensors registered an anomaly in the maintenance district. Elevated emotional readings, unregulated crying, someone had broken protocol, and someone would have to answer for it. She came to him at dawn, when the twin suns of Auralis Prime painted the ice fields in shades of violet and gold. Marcus was running diagnostics on the reactor's thermal exchange system when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned, and there she was, wrapped in a heavy cloak that hid everything but those haunting eyes. "Where did you hear that word?" Her voice was steady, but he could hear the tremor underneath, like a reactor core on the edge of instability. There was a reason that word had been erased, and it wasn't what he imagined. Marcus gestured to a maintenance office nearby, away from the security drones that patrolled the reactor perimeter. Once inside, with the door sealed, she pulled back her hood. In the bright work lights, he could see her face clearly for the first time. Beautiful in that alien way, all angles and luminescence, but marked by something he recognized: exhaustion, the kind that came from carrying weight too long. "Old mural near the South Access Tunnel," he said. "Mostly covered in ice, but I could make out the word. I thought it meant kindness or—" He trailed off, seeing her expression. "It means more than that," Serainai said softly. "Ahluma. In our oldest language, it translates roughly to giving without receipt. To do good without contract, without obligation, without expectation of return." She paused. "It was the foundation of our civilization once, before we decided it was weakness." She explained it all then, standing in that sterile office while the reactor hummed in the background. 300 years ago, Auralis Prime had been different. The Orinians had built their empire on the principle of Aluma, on mutual care, on bonds that transcended logic. But then came the servant revolts, when the lower castes rose up, demanding equality. The revolution had been bloody, chaotic, driven by passion rather than reason. Her family had signed the decree that ended it. They'd reasoned that if emotion could cause such devastation, then emotion itself must be the enemy. Aluma was banned, not just the word, but the concept. Every act of kindness had to be logged, registered, made transactional. Helping someone without documented reason became illegal. My great-great-grandfather believed he was saving civilization, she said, and Marcus heard the bitterness there. Instead, he killed it. We've been corpses pretending to live ever since. She carried the guilt of cultural genocide in her blood. You cried because you remembered what you lost? Marcus asked. No. Seraine met his eyes. Because you made me remember what we are. Marcus didn't know what to say to that. He did what felt natural, offered her coffee from his thermos. She took it hesitantly, sniffed it, and her face went through a fascinating journey of disgust and determination. You consume stimulant liquids at dawn? She asked, taking a tiny sip and immediately regretting it. We call it breakfast, Marcus said, and despite everything, he almost smiled. You don't have to drink it. No, She took another sip, forcing it down. If I'm going to remember how to feel, I might as well suffer properly. He thought he was helping, but he'd opened a wound that never healed. Over the next week, Seraine began to thaw in his presence. She'd slip away from the tavern on her breaks, meet him at the reactor site, and they'd talk. She told him about the old festivals that had been banned, the songs that existed only in secret recordings, the way her grandmother had whispered stories of a warmer time before falling silent forever. Marcus, in turn, told her about Earth, about humanity's messy history, about how his species had nearly destroyed itself a dozen times and somehow stumbled forward anyway. He told her about his daughter back home, about the last argument they'd had before he took this contract, about regrets and hopes. Your people embrace chaos, Seraine observed one evening. They were sitting in the maintenance office, sharing what Marcus insisted on calling dinner, though she'd barely touched the ration bar he'd offered. We don't have much choice, Marcus said. Chaos is kind of our default setting, and yet you survive, thrive even. She looked at him curiously. How? Honestly, I think it's because we care about each other even when it doesn't make sense to, even when it hurts. The reactor wasn't for heating. It never was. That's when Seraine told him what she'd overheard while serving drinks to Imperial officers. The reactor Marcus had been repairing wasn't meant to warm Auralis Prime. It was being converted into an orbital weapon. Once complete, it would focus thermal energy into a beam capable of turning entire colonies into ash. The target, rebel settlements on the outer moons where dissident Aurinians still practiced the old ways. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. He thought of the Darrow and Boone energy systems panel he'd installed last week, the one that seemed over-engineered for a simple climate device. He thought of the unusual firing chambers, the targeting sensors they told him were for precision heating. They're going to test it in 6 days, Seraine continued. On New Solace Colony. 300,000 people, Marcus. They'll call it an accident, a malfunction, but it's murder. We have to stop it, Marcus said immediately. If you do that, you'll die, she said flatly. The only way to prevent the firing sequence is to manually reinitialize the core from inside the reactor chamber. The radiation alone would kill a human in minutes. And even if you somehow survived that, the Imperial Guard would execute you for sabotage. And then she said something that froze his blood. But I suppose that's very Aluma of you, isn't it? To die for people you'll never meet. Marcus sat back, his mind racing. She was right, of course. Every logical calculation said to walk away, report to his supervisor, let someone else handle it. He was just an engineer. He wasn't a hero. I'm not a hero, he said out loud. I'm just a tired engineer who's already made too many compromises. Then why are you smiling? Seraine asked. Marcus realized he was. Because I just figured out how to fix this mess, and it's probably going to be the stupidest plan you've ever heard. He explained. The reactor's maintenance channel broadcast continuously across the entire planet, a holdover from the old days when they used it for emergency communications. If he could access it, record a message, he could transmit anything to every Aurinian on the planet, including the word they banned, Seraine whispered, including Aluma. Would it matter? Marcus asked. If millions of your people heard it again, would it change anything? She was quiet for a long moment. Then, in my childhood, before they found and destroyed the recordings, I heard a song. My grandmother sang it in secret. It was called Aluma, and it made me feel— She struggled for words. Connected, like I was part of something bigger than logic. Could you sing it again? If I do, we're both dead. Humans? Marcus said, pouring her more terrible coffee. We're really good at being dead. It's the living part we're still figuring out. She didn't laugh, but for the first time since he'd met her, Sarai smiled. It was small, tentative, like a muscle learning its function after decades of disuse. And in that smile, Marcus saw what 300 years of imposed silence had stolen from an entire species. The simple ability to connect without calculation, to feel without permission. They had 4 days to remember their people, how to be alive. They monitored every conversation, and now they knew who had spoken the unspeakable. The surveillance report reached Archon Velchris in his obsidian tower overlooking the capital. He read it twice, his aged eyes narrowing at the words, emotional outbreak, forbidden terminology, human involvement. Velchris had served on the council for 70 years. He'd signed execution orders without hesitation, maintained order through calculated force, and never questioned the wisdom of the decree. But when he read the word Ahluma in the report, his hand trembled. Just for a moment, just enough to notice. He authorized immediate surveillance of the human engineer. Standard protocol. Nothing more. Marcus worked through the night, his hands moving through the reactor's guts while his mind mapped the plan. It was insane, really. Hijack a planetary broadcast system, transmit a forbidden word, somehow prevent a genocide, and maybe, possibly, not die in the process. The odds were terrible. But then again, humans had built a civilization on terrible odds. Marcus had 3 choices. All of them ended in death. At 0300 hours, Sarai slipped into the maintenance tunnel where he was working. She'd brought food, the Orinian kind that tasted like metal and regret, but it was sustenance. They sat in the dim emergency lighting, surrounded by conduits that hummed with lethal energy. "Can I show you something?" she asked quietly. Without waiting for an answer, she pulled back the sleeve of her robe. Her forearm, normally that beautiful blue-silver, was marred by scars. Not accidental scars, deliberate ones, burned into her skin in precise patterns, old enough to have faded but deep enough to never fully disappear. These were the marks of those who tried to remember. "When I was young," she said, voice barely above a whisper, "I sang the Aluma song to my sister. Someone heard, someone reported. The council doesn't execute for first offenses. They mark you instead. A reminder, a warning." Marcus felt sick. "How old were you?" 9 in your years?" She traced one of the scars with a finger. "My sister was 6. They marked her too, so she'd remember the cost of my mistake." "That's not a mistake," Marcus said, anger rising in his chest. "That's being a child. That's being alive." The council would say emotion leads to chaos. They'd point to the servant revolts, to the blood, to the destruction. They'd say this pain saved us from worse pain. She looked at him, and they wouldn't be entirely wrong. The revolts were terrible. People died for passion, for pride, for love. Sometimes I wonder if we chose the wrong solution to the right problem, or the right solution to the wrong problem. Marcus was silent for a long moment. Then, "My daughter and I fought before I left Earth. Stupid stuff. She wanted to study art. I wanted her to do something practical. We said things, hurt each other. I left without apologizing, figuring I'd fix it when I got back." He met Sarai's eyes. "But that fight, that messy, painful, stupid fight, that was us loving each other badly. And I'd take that over perfect silence any day." She smiled sadly. "You're a strange species. We really are." The reactor would be activated in 18 hours, and it would burn millions. They worked through the dawn, Marcus mapping the broadcast system while Sarai helped him navigate the labyrinth of Orinian technical documentation. The plan was simple in theory. Access the maintenance channel, bypassed the security protocols, broadcast the message before anyone could stop them. Simple, suicidal, possibly stupid enough to work. "I'm not a hero," Marcus muttered, staring at the tangle of wiring he'd need to reconnect. "I'm just a tired engineer who really should have stayed on Earth and fixed my relationship with my kid, instead of running away to freeze on an alien planet." It was the most honest thing he'd said in weeks. "Heroes are just people who stay when leaving makes more sense," Seraine said. She was learning his language, the metaphors and idioms that made human communication half chaos and half poetry. Marcus laughed, sharp and bitter. "Then I guess I'm the idiot who doesn't know when to leave." He worked for another hour, splicing connections, rerouting power. The broadcast system was old, incredibly old, built before the decree when the Orinians still valued widespread communication. Ironically, it was that ancient infrastructure that would let him hijack it now. But there was a problem, a critical junction that needed to stay closed during the broadcast, or the whole system would short out. He needed something to hold it in place, something that could withstand the heat and maintain pressure. Marcus stared at the junction for 10 minutes. Then he started laughing. "What?" Seraine asked. "I'm going to save your planet with duct tape." He pulled out what humans called emergency repair tape, a silvery strip of adhesive that was technically rated for temporary fixes only. The Orinians had nothing like it. Their repairs were precise, permanent, planned months in advance. This was pure improvisation, pure human chaos. He wrapped the junction carefully, reinforcing it with 3 layers. It looked ridiculous. It violated every engineering standard the Orinians had. It probably shouldn't work. "This is your solution?" Seraine asked, staring at the tape. "Back home we call this a gambiara. A quick fix that shouldn't work, but does." Marcus grinned. "Your people plan everything perfectly. We just tape stuff together and hope." "That's terrifying." "Yeah, but we're still here. Primitive human engineering, the Council would call it." But it would work. It had to. They recorded the message at dawn. Marcus speaking the word, explaining its meaning in both human and Orinian terms. Seraine singing the old song, her voice cracking but strong. 40 seconds total. 40 seconds to try to wake an empire from a 300-year sleep. As they finished, alarms shrieked through the complex. Security drones lifted from their perches. In his tower, Velchris had made his decision. "They're coming," Seraine said, reading the security feeds on her datapad. "We have to transmit now, or not at all." Marcus looked at the upload interface. One button. Press it, and broadcast to billions. Press it, and guarantee they'd be hunted. Press it, and maybe, possibly, save 300,000 people from burning. His hand didn't shake. That surprised him. "For someone who says he's not a hero," Seraine said quietly, "you're doing a remarkable impression of one." "Just press the damn button," Marcus said. She did. And across Oralis Prime, in homes and towers and frozen streets, every communication device activated simultaneously. Static cleared. And then, impossibly, the word they'd been forbidden to hear for 3 centuries. Aluma. The drones were closing in. They had minutes, maybe less, but the message was out. For better or worse, the Empire would remember what it had tried to forget. And somewhere in his tower, Archon Velchris listened to the broadcast with his eyes closed, and for exactly 3 seconds allowed himself to feel the weight of 300 years of silence. Then he opened his eyes and authorized lethal force. The transmission lasted only 40 seconds, but the entire planet stopped. In the capital towers, bureaucrats froze mid-sentence. In the maintenance districts, workers let their tools fall from suddenly nerveless hands. In the frozen wastes, explorers stood still as statues, listening to something they'd never heard but somehow recognized. The word came first, spoken in Marcus's rough, human voice, Aluma. Then his explanation, simple and direct. It means to give without taking, to help without earning. to care because caring itself is reason enough. And then the song. Sarai Ney's voice, uncertain at first, but growing stronger, singing words in ancient Orinian that translated roughly to, "We are more than our thoughts. We are more than our plans. We are the spaces between logic, the warmth between stars." For the first time in 300 years they heard, and they wept. In his modest dwelling, a factory supervisor named Keth, the tavern owner, sat down heavily on his floor, tears streaming down his weathered face. He'd been 17 when they banned the word. He'd forgotten he remembered it. In a medical facility, a doctor hesitated over a patient who couldn't pay for treatment. Then, hands shaking, proceeded with the surgery anyway. Because she remembered that once, healing hadn't required transaction. In a school, a teacher stopped her lecture on efficient emotional suppression, looked at her students, really looked at them, and saw not future workers, but children. Frightened children who'd never been taught it was okay to be frightened. Across the planet, in millions of hearts, something long dormant stirred, cracked, bloomed. But in the Imperial Towers, the Council moved into action. Marcus and Sarai Ney ran through the reactor's maintenance tunnels, the sound of pursuit echoing behind them. Drones, security forces, automated defenses, all converging on their position. "The core!" Marcus shouted. "We need to reach the core." They burst through a security door, Marcus's override codes still working. For now. The reactor's heart lay ahead, a chamber of impossible heat and barely contained energy. If he could reach the manual controls, reprogram the firing sequence, he could stop the weapon from ever activating. But it would mean entering the radiation zone. For a human, it would mean death. The drones arrived first. They came through the walls, the ceiling, impossibly fast and precise. Marcus saw the weapons charging, saw Sarai Ney realize what was about to happen. She moved faster, threw herself between Marcus and the nearest drone. The energy bolt took her in the shoulder, spinning her around. Blue blood, luminescent and terrible, sprayed across the white walls. "No!" Marcus caught her as she fell. Her skin was already paling, the light in her fading. "Go!" she gasped. "The core! You have to!" "I'm not leaving you. You already did the important part." She smiled, and it was genuine now, no hesitation. "You reminded us. Now go remind them they can choose warmth over cold." She ran toward fire, not to save him, to save them all. Marcus laid her gently against the wall, knowing he'd never see her alive again. Then he ran for the core chamber. The radiation hit him the moment the door sealed behind him. He felt it immediately, a sick heat that had nothing to do with temperature. His badge screamed warnings. His skin prickled. Every cell in his body began the process of unraveling. But his hands still worked. The manual control panel was exactly where the schematics said it would be. Marcus's fingers flew across the interface, rerouting power, disabling the weapon systems, reprogramming the core's purpose. The reactor had been designed to heat a planet once before they'd corrupted it. He'd make it heat one again. Through the chamber's viewing port he could see security forces gathering. Velcris himself stood at the forefront, ancient and terrible in his ceremonial armor. Marcus activated the broadcast system one last time. His voice, already weakening, transmitted across the planet. "You called this weakness, but caring isn't weak. It's the hardest thing in the universe, and it's the only thing that matters." Then he pulled the final lever. The reactor didn't explode. It transformed. Energy designed to destroy, redirected to create. Heat meant to burn colonies, spread instead across Auralis Prime's atmosphere. The climate control that had kept the planet frozen for centuries inverted, warmed, bloomed. The change started at the reactor site and expanded outward at the speed of thought. Snow, ancient and eternal, began to melt. Ice that had locked the surface for 300 years turned to water, water that fed soil that remembered somehow how to sustain life. In the capital, people rushed to their windows and watched impossible spring arrive in real time. Marcus collapsed against the control panel. Through the chamber's speakers, he could hear chaos outside. Orders shouted, confusion, fear, but also something else, something that sounded like wonder. "Did it work?" he whispered. Not sure if anyone could hear. Silence. Then, from outside the chamber, drifting through the walls and radiation shielding, a sound that Auralis Prime hadn't heard in 3 centuries. A bird's song. Somewhere, impossibly, life had found a way to return. And it was singing. Marcus smiled, closed his eyes. And in that moment, Archon Vel'Kris stood outside the reactor chamber, watching readouts that showed the planet warming, transforming, living again. He'd ordered the execution. He'd sent the drones. He'd spent 70 years maintaining the decree his predecessor had signed. But now, watching spring arrive through sacrifice, he made a different choice. "Stand down," he ordered. "Seal the chamber, preserve it, and someone—" His voice cracked, just barely. "Someone find where that bird is nesting. Protect it." Inside the reactor core, Marcus Hale heard none of this. He was already gone. His last thought not of his own death, but of a daughter on Earth he'd never get to apologize to, and of an alien woman who'd learned to smile again because he'd spoken a single word. The message board inside the core, a relic from the Darrow and Boone Energy Systems installation, flickered one last time. Its maintenance log, set to automatic, recorded, "System restored, primary purpose achieved, climate stabilized, operator, M. Hale, status, mission complete." And underneath, in code that would take researchers years to decipher, hidden frequencies from Serene's song played on repeat. "He fed one, now we feed all." Outside, the snow continued to melt. Spring, brutal and beautiful, came to a world that had forgotten seasons, and somewhere in a medical facility, Serene opened her eyes to see sunlight, actual sunlight streaming through windows that had only ever shown ice. "He did it," a medic whispered, watching the news feeds. "The human. He warmed the world." Serene tried to speak but couldn't, so she cried instead. Not from grief this time, from something she'd forgotten how to name. Hope. He never saw the spring. But the spring came. 6 months after Marcus Hale died in the reactor core, Auralis Prime was unrecognizable. Where ice had reigned for 3 centuries, forests now grew. Where silence had been law, the sound of water running through rebuilt channels filled the air. Where emotional suppression had been doctrine, people laughed, cried, argued, lived. The transformation hadn't been easy. The council had fractured, with Vel'Kris leading a reform faction against hardliners who insisted the decree had been correct. There were protests, counter-protests, debates that ran through the night in forums that would have been illegal a year ago. It was messy, chaotic, human, in the way the Aurinians were learning to understand the word. Serene stood at the center of it all, not by choice, but by necessity. The woman who'd served drinks in a forgotten tavern had become the voice of what they were calling the awakening. She spoke at gatherings, helped draft new cultural guidelines, and most importantly, led the effort to restore the sanctuaries of Aluma that had been buried for centuries. She still had nightmares about the reactor, still woke up feeling the energy bolt tear through her shoulder, watching Marcus run toward certain death. But she'd learned something from him. Grief didn't have to be silent. Pain could be shared, and in sharing, transformed. The monument didn't have his face. It had only the word. They built it where the reactor had stood, before they'd dismantled the weapon components and converted the rest into the climate control system Marcus had died to create. A simple structure of crystalline stone, 40 feet tall, with the word Ahluma carved in both Aurinian script and human letters. No statue, no heroic pose. Just the word, glowing softly at night, visible for miles. He wouldn't have wanted his face up there, Serene had insisted to the planning committee. He'd want us to remember the idea, not the man. But in the base of the monument, sealed in a preservation chamber, they'd placed his personal effects, his datapad with messages to his daughter he'd never sent, his work badge, and the napkin he'd offered her that first night, still stained with her tears. The memorial garden surrounded the monument, and that's where Sarai spent most of her time. She wasn't a gardener, had no training in horticulture, but she'd learned. Someone had to tend the new growth, the flowers that were just remembering how to bloom after centuries of cold. She was there when the child found her. A young Iranian, maybe 7 years old, with the kind of fearless curiosity that came from being raised after the decree fell. The child approached the monument, studying it with the intense focus of the young, then turned to Sarai. "What does that word mean?" And when the child asked, she finally knew how to answer. Sarai knelt down to the child's level. Around them, the garden rustled with life. Birds nested in trees that shouldn't exist. Insects hummed through air that had been dead for 300 years. Water burbled through streams that fed flowers Marcus would never see. "It means doing good without expecting return," she said. "It means helping, because helping itself is enough. It means—" She paused, finding words that had taken her months to understand. "It means being human, even if you're not human." The child thought about this seriously. Like the man who died here? He was being a haluma? He was showing us how. Sarai felt warmth on her face and realized she was crying again. She'd gotten used to it these past months. Crying didn't frighten her anymore. He reminded us that caring isn't weakness. It's the strongest thing in the universe. Because it's hard. Because it's impossible to prove it matters, but we do it anyway. That's what makes it strong. The child nodded, satisfied with this answer in the way only children could be, and ran off to explore the garden. Sarai watched her go. This child, who would grow up in a world where feeling was allowed, where Ahluma was taught in schools, where the decree was history instead of law. All because a tired human engineer had spoken a word he barely understood. She stood and walked to the far corner of the garden to her favorite spot. A small plant grew there, something the botanists were still trying to classify. It had appeared 3 months ago, sprouting from soil that had been sterile for centuries. The leaves were green, distinctly green in a way that didn't match Aurinian flora. They'd found seeds in Marcus's jacket pocket when they'd recovered his body. Earth seeds. Tomato plants of all things. He'd apparently kept them as a reminder of home, never imagining they'd be buried with him and somehow find their way to soil. One had survived, had adapted, was growing in alien soil under alien suns, impossible, but undeniable. Sarai touched one of the leaves gently. "You stubborn thing," she whispered. "Just like him." The wind picked up, warm for the first time in her lifetime, carrying with it the scent of flowers and growing things. She closed her eyes and let herself feel it. Really feel it. The warmth on her crystalline skin, the way her body responded with something that might have been joy, might have been grief, might have been both at once. The heat came back, she said to the air, to the memory, to the ghost she sometimes felt watching over the garden. "You asked if it worked." "Yes, Marcus, it worked." In the capital, the council was voting on the final dissolution of the emotional decree. In the districts, new taverns opened where people gathered to share stories, not just efficiency reports. In schools, children learned the Ahluma song alongside their mathematics. In every corner of Auralis Prime, the Empire was learning to be alive again. It wasn't perfect. There were still hardliners who insisted logic was superior. There were crimes of passion, the kind the decree had been designed to prevent. People hurt each other in ways that pure logic never would have allowed, but they also helped each other in ways logic never could have predicted. They were messy, complicated, beautifully, terribly, wonderfully alive, and in a small apartment in New Solace Colony, 300,000 people who should have been ash went about their lives, never knowing how close they'd come to extinction, saved by a word they'd forgotten, and a human who'd remembered it for them. Sarai stayed in the garden until dusk, when the monument's glow began to illuminate the growing darkness. Before she left, she did what she always did. Placed her hand on the word carved in stone, felt the warmth the internal lighting gave off, and spoke, "Thank you for reminding us." We won't forget again." But as she turned to leave, something made her pause. Movement in the far corner of the garden near the growing earth plant. She walked closer, her heart suddenly racing for no logical reason. A second sprout had emerged from the soil, fresh, green, reaching toward the light. Serainai knelt down, touching the soil gently. It was rich now, alive with microorganisms that had awakened with the warming. And somehow, impossibly, more seeds were germinating, not just surviving, but spreading. Life, it seemed, was stubborn, and human stubbornness, even in death, had a way of persisting. She looked up at the monument, at the word glowing against the deepening purple sky, and smiled. "You're still teaching us," she said quietly. "Even now. Especially now." Somewhere in the capital, Velchris sat in his tower. No longer Archon, but simply an old man who'd lived through too much history. He held a datapad displaying the day's reports. Emotional education centers opening across the planet, the last of the surveillance networks being dismantled, proposals for cultural exchange with Earth, and a message from Serainai requesting permission to establish formal contact with Marcus Hale's family, to tell his daughter what her father had done, to help bridge the gap between species through shared grief, shared hope, shared humanity. Velchris approved it without hesitation. Then, in the privacy of his quarters, where no one could see, he did something he hadn't done in 70 years of service to the decree. He cried. The universe is vast and cold and governed by laws that care nothing for compassion. Empires rise on logic, on calculation, on the careful elimination of variables that cannot be controlled. Emotions are chaotic. Caring is inefficient. Sacrifice makes no mathematical sense. And yet, a single human, armed with nothing but an ancient word and the bone-deep stubbornness of his species, had reminded an empire that surviving isn't the same as living, that warmth is worth dying for, that some words are dangerous precisely because they're true. The Aurinians called it the Awakening. Historians would debate its causes for generations. Philosophers would argue about the necessity of the decree and the wisdom of its fall. But in the garden, where impossible earth plants grew in alien soil, where a monument to a forgotten word glowed against the night, where spring had returned to a world that had forgotten seasons, the truth was simpler. Humanity doesn't conquer through strength. We stumble forward through care. We survive because we're foolish enough to help each other when logic says to save ourselves. We thrive because we remember. Even when forgetting would be easier, that connection is worth any cost. Marcus Hale brought no weapons, no technology, no grand strategy. He brought a word, and the courage to speak it. Sometimes, that's enough to change everything. The stars above Aralis Prime shone brighter now, or perhaps they just seemed that way to people who'd learned to see them through tears of joy instead of suppressed grief. The planet turned, warm and alive, a testament to what could be accomplished when someone cared enough to die for strangers. And in the garden, the earth seeds continued to grow. Stubborn, impossible, human, just like the man who'd planted them without knowing, in soil that would remember him long after his name was forgotten, in a world that would never forget what he'd taught them, that the most dangerous words are the ones that remind us we're alive, that the strongest force in the universe is caring when it makes no sense, that sometimes being human has nothing to do with what species you are. It's about choosing warmth over cold, hope over logic, connection over safety. It's about Aluma. And it's about remembering that we're all just trying to survive in the space between stars. And the only thing that makes that journey worthwhile is doing it together. Even when together means dying so others can remember how to live. In the end, Marcus didn't save Aralis Prime with technology, strategy, or heroism. He saved it with something far more inconvenient. The simple, irrational human decision to care when every calculation said, don't. Maybe that's our real superpower, doing the right thing even when the universe laughs at the odds. But it makes you wonder, when was the last time you cared for someone with no contract attached? How often do we trade warmth for control, just because cold is easier to manage? And if a single word can thaw a frozen empire, what could one honest gesture thaw in your own life? If you stayed all the way to this moment, write Ahaluma in the comments so I know you're part of the tribe who believes warmth still matters. Tell me where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if this story reminded you that being human is messy but worth it. Drop a like to help this tale travel. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that compassion isn't a weakness, and don't forget to watch the next video waiting for you in the final card. After all, stories are better when we travel through the stars together.